So, and I want to just bring in another fiber on this then, which is what someone was saying about marginal peoples being the ones who tend to have the most powerful mutual aid. And then I want to talk about what maybe mutual aid is, try to talk about it. And here are a couple of books, really good ones. This one's called Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. This woman, Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, is still alive, and may she live long and well and healthily, and she's up at the University of New York. And this is a really powerful book for everyone. It's like I'm getting goosebumps the whole time I'm reading it because of the profound nature of historic African American cooperative economic thought and practice, which I didn't know anything about, and how deep it goes, and how the civil rights movement basically came out of African American mutual aid societies and churches. Those are the two cultural institutions that through collaborative economics created cultural glue, right, among the people participating in them, and then led up to the level of trust and organization that was necessary to coordinate the civil rights movement so tightly, which civil rights movement's still the most kind of effectively coordinated social movement in the history of the US, right? All right, well, yeah, we can dispute that. Yeah, all right. I was baiting you, but one of the most. But so what happened, right, with African Americans going into the marginal people thing, and how, right, this observation a lot of us make that people who are not winning in the economy are those who've tended to band together in mutual aid the most, because that's how we get power, right? That's how we the power for self-determination, how we get that back. So in this country, very tangible way, when slavery ended, right, which what that really meant was that that was a legislative thing that didn't change the culture around institutionalized racism very much at all, not quickly anyway. Then what happened is that all the banks and lending institutions are dominated by white supremacists, right? I mean, that being white supremacists was just part of the water that the U.S. was swimming in at that point. And so dark-skinned people couldn't get loans to buy houses or to buy land or to go to higher education, et cetera, start businesses, right? So that's a denial of the basis of wealth creation and of empowerment, community empowerment. So what did African Americans do? Well, they banded together and created mutual aid societies. And there were many of them. There were hundreds of mutual aid societies, black mutual aid societies across the U.S. And then they got more formal over time. They started to set up their own banks. Once credit unions became a thing, they started establishing their own credit unions. Some of those credit unions are still in existence now. Others have been consolidated into other credit unions, like Self-Help Credit Union has absorbed some of the historically black credit unions. And then they used those credit unions to collaboratively fund the things that they knew they needed. Right, so that ended up being things like blocks of houses in cities, land for farming. They started their own hospitals. There are all these mutual aid hospitals. They started their own schools, leadership training initiatives, and on and on and on. And so those meeting of basic needs, right, what that did is it's hard to pay attention to organizing yourself as a community when you don't have basic access to food or land or healthcare, right? So they meet basic needs. And then that starts to create this tighter knit community, because now everyone's investing together and choosing what to invest in, and then knowing, oh, we chose to fund that hospital together, we chose to fund that school together, we're in this together, creates a tighter community through relational economics. And then that tighter cultural glue led to the ability to organize politically in a profound way later on, right? So that's instructive. And this book, yeah, really, I want to have like a book group around that. The last third of the book is all about her essentially creating a patterns language, she doesn't call it that, of mutual aid and cooperative economics in the US based on learned lessons from the past. And then this one, Democratic Renewal and the Mutual Aid Legacy of US Mexicans, right? So mutualistas are Mexican and other Latin American mutual aid societies, both in those places and also in the US, and those are really active. I just had the honor and shock of learning that there's this amazing mutual aid stuff going on over in Emma, right outside of West Asheville, Dulce Lomita, I don't know if any of y'all know them. Dulce Lomita. Yeah, uh-huh.
No, and I lived there for...
Yeah, I know, right? Someone else I was talking to who lived in Emma didn't know. It's like this multi-decade-old, intergenerational, kind of loose community of different Latin American folk, but who have been actively practicing savings pools, which I'll talk more about in a minute about exactly how those work, to pool money and loan money to each other to start businesses, buy land, get little pieces of equipment they need for businesses, things like that. And recently, they've been pooling money to create what are called resident-owned mobile home communities, right? So it's trailer parks, but where they own the land and own the trailers, which is a big difference from renting. It's a world of difference, right? This is in Emma, right? If you go up on North Louisiana, how do you say that word? Louisiana, North Louisiana Avenue over Patton Avenue, and go up there north. It's just up in that area over the railroad tracks. There's 3 different resident-owned mobile home communities within a half mile of each other. If you're heading out of town, like west on Patton, is that what you mean? Yeah, up north there. Mm-hmm. I think just outside the city limits. And so, so again, these folks, right, stuck in a oppressed and marginalized type of position in the U.S. economy and the way that our society and institutionalized racism is structured. And so how do they respond? By empowering themselves through banding together, pooling resources, getting organized, cooperating, right? And getting into a better position that way, yeah.
Would CoThink be an example?
Definitely, yeah. CoThink is another really great one to highlight that's run by people of color in Asheville that is kind of, my understanding, a hybrid of loaning and granting money to entrepreneurs who are people of color based on investments or donations from anybody. So then kind of tucking that back in, I got into this stuff from the direction of permaculture, and that's what I've been doing for 13, 14 years is kind of being a permaculture consultant and designer and educator. And I lived down at Earthaven and I have for 7 years. And I've come across, what I think are some kind of fundamental limitations in the way that we've been going about permaculture since the movement started back with Bill Mollison and David Holmgren in the late 70s in Australia. And basically, it's that we haven't taken economics seriously enough. That's the simple way of saying it. That even though if you look in Bill Mollison's designer's manual, the entire last chapter is dedicated to all this radical bioregional scale cooperative economic stuff. People hardly ever talk about that. It gets like an hour in most permaculture design courses, right? In my opinion now, I'm like, we need to flip that over. And that's like the first half of the whole thing is racial equity and economic structures should be the first half of the PDC, and then branching out into all the land use stuff from there. How do land use decisions serve a greater picture of cultural topsoil creation and racial inclusion and collaborative economics, right?
Land use is a whole lot easier.
Yeah, that's true. It's easier to understand planting mulberries for your chickens and grazing the slugs off your shiitake logs with ducks than it is how to deal with 6,000-year history of trauma and cultural genocide, right? So, but all of the stuff that we're trying to do physically is hitting a dead end, and it's hitting a limiting bottleneck in how impactful we can be because we're not addressing the underlying economics. So the rubber really starts to hit the road when you get to this question of land access and gentrification. It's like, well, if we can't get access to tens of thousands of acres of gently sloped, degraded pasture land in western North Carolina to convert it to silvopasture and sequester some serious carbon and create livelihoods for thousands of carbon farmers, then we're not going to do it. It's not going to happen. The land use that needs to happen is based on the economic viability, and there being economically viable models for people to change our lives and then transform at that scale. And unless we transform at that scale, we're just piddling around at the edges with a little hobby while the world is going the direction it's going. So I've come to the position that to have that kind of deep level of cultural transformation where permaculture type ideas, and we don't need to call it permaculture or whatever, systemic healing, let's call it, right? Ecological, cultural revitalization, not to mention addressing climate change, for that to happen at a serious level, it has to be an economic, cultural transformation, yeah. And so mutual aid, I came across this like really 5 years ago. That's it. I just started kind of learning about it. I don't think I'd ever heard the phrase mutual aid before then, and it's like not in the vernacular of our society very much anymore. Even though, according to one book I was reading, a third of our U.S. residents in 1900 were members of mutual aid societies, right? But then what happened is the federal social safety net programs came along, right, in the kind of Great Depression era, and so then Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and those started to, it took the worst, the most intense pressure that was being exerted on people for basic survival, and it took a little bit of that pressure off. Because that's what mutual aid societies were filling that role before. Mutual aid societies were the ones providing health care for people who couldn't afford it, providing basic food and shelter needs for people who didn't have access to it, dealing with injuries and dying, and like Claire was saying too, by the way, funerals and death care are historically a huge part of mutual aid societies. And so then the federal social safety programs came in, and then privatization forces came in. And there's like one particular story where, so like I was saying, there were mutual aid hospitals, right? And they were financed in various collaborative means, and they were more modest than private hospitals, but they were hospitals. And there were entire associations of doctors who worked just under contract with mutual aid societies, entire associations of doctors, right? So the mutual aid societies negotiated with those doctors' associations for prices. Then these private doctor associations came in and wanted to make more money. And so they started they created this coherent national agenda and introduced it in all the state legislatures, just like ALEC is doing now, right? You all know about that? Yeah, American Legislative Exchange Council, right? A corporate funded group that if you're like, why is the exact same wording in a law in the Wisconsin state legislature and the North Carolina state legislature emerging with the exact same wording? It's because ALEC, this corporate conglomerate, what's that?
Koch brothers.
Yeah, Koch brothers are a big funder. They go through and work with all the state legislators and promote the same ideology of legislation at that level. So that's been happening for a long time. The doctors did that at the state level and promoted all these laws that, for instance, created extremely expensive building codes for hospitals and made it so that the mutual aid hospitals couldn't stay in business and put them out of business, right? And so that was really successful, and they put a lot of that core healthcare function out of business within mutual aid societies.
They tend to also use regulations for our good.
Right. Yeah, right, because it makes the hospitals safer. And maybe there were some elements of that too. It's important not to get fundamentalist about any of this, to recognize the bits of truth that were in that too. So that brings us to healthcare. So healthcare, right, has always been a huge part of the mutual aid picture. And when you take a step back and look at the structure of our economy, or even look at your own life, think about how big an issue healthcare is, right? That's why it's a giant fight at the fundamental root of our whole federal government right now, is what to do about healthcare, because it's a huge part of the economy, taking care of people's health, especially if we let it get to an emergency state. But also, even just to stay healthy takes a lot of human energy, right? And so that translates into money. And so that was the core of a lot of these groups, was providing healthcare. And what I actually learned by reading Jessica Nemhart's book is that a lot of the mutual aid groups first started healthcare functions, and then they started banks with the money that began flowing from the healthcare function. I had assumed it was the other way around. You'd start, say, a credit union, and then use a credit union to fund into existence a healthcare co-op. But actually, it's the other way, because like you start a healthcare cooperative, you got 10,000 people in it. People are paying dues and fees, and you've got grants coming in and all that stuff. That's many millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars. Well, at that point, you're then either putting those tens of millions of dollars in some other bank to hold it while you use it, or you start your own bank to manage that money and to be able to work with it in investments, right? Which is the whole thing about banking, is what are banks doing with the money while they're holding it, right? And most of the banks are using it to fund fossil fuel exploration and all kinds of stuff that I don't support. But instead, you can have that money while it's in the flow-through process be funding cooperative businesses and all manner of cool things, right? So that was a fundamental insight, is healthcare is at the basis of it. And so I got into this. I was studying it. It was like 5 years ago, began reading the books, and then something happened in 2016. Someone got into office. I won't talk about it too much. And that really threw the switch, the alarm switch for me. Is like, wow, we're going in a really dangerous direction as a society. We need profound, transformative leadership on climate resilience and the way it's sourced at the same root with a lot of social issues. And what we're getting is the opposite of that profound, transformative leadership. How do we turn this around? And so I was like, wow, well, mutual aid is about the most profound, transformative cultural pattern that I've discovered reading anywhere about things that our ancestors have done, indigenous people have done to deal with really difficult circumstances and turn it around. So that's kind of where this insight of the regional mutual aid group came from. And right at the beginning, I was talking about it with lots of people. Patrick and I have been talking about this for a couple years now, and kind of cooking it up together, and recognizing that there are like a few key elements, and hopefully we'll begin dovetailing this with Mondragon in a second. I'm still chewing on what Patrick was sharing with us and how it does or doesn't dovetail. But I think that any regional mutual aid initiative needs to deal with healthcare. Personally, I believe that. If it's not dealing with healthcare, then it's missing a major need that's unmet for a lot of people. As we saw in this room, and we said, who here has their healthcare needs met? And 2 people raised their hands in this room. We said fully met, so that's a conditional. But and then it needs to deal with climate change. It's like if we're doing anything on a regional scale and we're not dealing with climate change, we're setting ourselves up for essentially starvation. Not to be alarmist about it, but if you read it, yeah, among other things, violence, starvation, lots of suffering, species extinctions, and it needs to deal with banking and money flow, because that's at the root of what's going on. That was the insight. It's like, wow, if we're not making economics relational instead of transactional, if we're not linking in our economic activity deeply with our values, then that same value system that's actually in control is just going to keep coming back at us, and it's got the power, right? It's just going to keep coming back with different forms of eroding activity. And we have to keep putting our finger in the dam, right? So instead, what's the metaphor? Maybe we tear down the dam. I don't know. But instead, we have to do something else other than putting our finger in the dam. We have to take control of the dynamic and take control of our own economics.